Before we begin, I need to warn you. This case will disturb you in ways you cannot imagine. Not just because of what happened to 36-year-old Lacey Fletcher, but because of where it happened, and for how long. What you're about to hear is the story of a woman who disappeared without ever leaving her home. A woman who suffered in silence while life continued normally around her. And how a single 911 call would expose one of the most shocking cases of neglect in modern American history. If you're new to Crime Case Voices, this channel is dedicated to telling the stories of victims who deserve to be remembered and bringing awareness to cases that demand justice. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss a case. And if the story affects you the way it affected me, leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. Now let's begin. January 3rd, 2022. Slaughter, Louisiana. A quiet residential street where neighbors know each other's names and children play in front yards. The Fletcher home sat at the end of a cul-de-sac near Hog Bayou, in the 2500 block of Tom Drive, just off Louisiana Highway 412. A 911 call comes in around 10:30 in the morning. A mother's voice, shaking. "My daughter. She's not breathing." When East Feliciana Parish Coroner Dr. Ewell DeWitt Bickham III arrived at the scene, he had no idea what he was about to walk into. Slaughter first responders, the fire department, and sheriff's deputies had already arrived within 30 seconds of the call. They had deemed it was obviously a deceased individual and immediately called the coroner. Dr. Bickham arrived within 10 minutes. In 27 years as a coroner, he had seen death in every form imaginable. Car accidents, homicides, suicides, natural causes. He had dealt with decomposed bodies and every kind of death scenario. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared him for what he found in that living room. When I first walked in the house, it smelled of feces, fecal material, however you want to put that politely. It stunk. Dr. Bickham would later tell reporters, the smell wasn't just unpleasant. It was overwhelming, like a sewer or septic tank mixed with the unmistakable smell of death. It was a stench he had never encountered in his entire career, and it filled the entire home. There was a couch, a 1960s-style leather sofa, and on that couch was Lacey Fletcher. Except she wasn't just on the couch. She was in it. Her body, weighing just 96 pounds, had sunken into a crater worn completely through the upholstery and foam padding. The hole extended all the way through the cushion to the frame below. She had been there so long that she had essentially fused with the furniture itself. Her feet were crossed underneath her, sunk deep into the hole that her body had worn through years of sitting in the exact same position. The hole itself was filled with liquid stool and urine. The floor beneath the couch was buckling from the accumulated waste that had pooled there over the years. Dr. Bickham moved his camera to document the scene, breathing heavily as he captured the gap behind the sofa and the wall. A large wet patch was visible on the floor directly behind Lacey's body, which he believed was urine. Dr. Bickham would later testify about what he saw that day. The smell that hit him the moment he entered the room. The condition of Lacey's remains. The evidence all around him of prolonged, unimaginable suffering. And one conclusion that would shake this small Louisiana community to its core. Lacey Fletcher had been sitting on that couch in that same position for an estimated 12 years. 12 years of sitting in the same spot. 12 years without moving. 12 years while her parents lived their lives around her. Years later, Dr. Bickham would tell News Nation's Ashley Banfield, "I've seen every kind of death there is. I've never seen a homicide like this. I have never seen a human being literally tortured and allowed to die while she is alive. I've never seen that in my life." Lacey did not decompose. She rotted in her own body, in that hole, in that sewer, in the couch. Lacey Ellen Fletcher was born on November 25, 1985. There are photos of her as a child, smiling, normal, full of life. Birthday parties with cake and presents. Family gatherings during the holidays. School pictures where she's wearing the same awkward smile that every kid has in elementary school. Lacey was once a student at Brownfields Baptist Academy, where she loved playing volleyball. Her former teacher, Jerry Lowhowell, remembered her fondly. Lacey was precious and a wonderful spirit, She had the most beautiful blue eyes and the most precious smile. I am absolutely heartbroken. She was gentle and sweet and loving, and she deserved to be loved. By all accounts, Lacey had a completely normal childhood. But somewhere during her teenage years, something changed. In 2002, when Lacey was 16 years old, she disappeared from public view. Lacey began to withdraw. She became quieter, more isolated, reluctant to leave the house or interact with people outside her immediate family. Her parents would later claim she suffered from severe social anxiety and autism, though records show limited professional intervention. In 2000, when Lacey was 14, her parents consulted a psychologist. They returned to the same doctor 10 years later in 2010, but this was the last time the psychologist heard anything from the family. That was also the last year any medical professional saw Lacey Fletcher alive. The isolation grew worse. By her early 20s, Lacey had stopped going out entirely. No job, no friends, no social life whatsoever. And at some point around 2010, when Lacey was approximately 24 years old, she stopped leaving the couch. The question everyone would ask later: why didn't anyone help her? Why didn't her parents call a doctor? Why didn't they contact social services? Because Clay and Sheila Fletcher weren't recluses. They weren't living in chaos. Clay Fletcher was involved with the non-profit Baton Rouge Civil War Roundtable. Sheila Fletcher worked as a police and court clerk in Baker and more recently as an assistant to the city prosecutor in Zachary. She also served on Slaughter's Board of Aldermen for 4 years, most recently as mayor pro tem. These were people who should have known better, people who did know better, but what they did next would shock even seasoned investigators. Every morning, Clay and Sheila Fletcher got up, got dressed, and went to work. They attended church regularly. They maintained their home and yard. They participated in community activities. Sheila served in her official capacity as town alderman, attending meetings and making decisions about their community. To their neighbors, to their co-workers, to everyone who knew them, they were a respectable, normal couple. Clay and Sheila were college sweethearts. Clay had been an expert football player while Sheila was a member of the dance team. They had strong political connections in the area. They were prominent members of the community. Meanwhile, in their living room, their daughter was dying. The rest of the Fletcher home was clean and organized. The kitchen was spotless. The bedrooms were tidy. Everything was maintained. Everything was normal except for one room. The living room where Lacey sat rotting on a couch. The cognitive dissonance is almost impossible to comprehend. How do you walk past someone suffering every single day and do nothing? How do you maintain a professional career, serve on the town board, attend church, while your daughter wastes away in the next room? The medical evidence would later reveal the full horror of what Lacey endured. Dr. Bickham's autopsy report, conducted at the Jefferson Parish Forensic Center in Harvey, was explicit and damning. The official cause of death was severe medical neglect, which led to chronic malnutrition, acute starvation, immobility, acute ulcer formation, and osteomyelitis, which is a bone infection. This chain of medical crises finally led to sepsis, which caused her death. Lacey had been suffering from severe malnutrition. At 36 years old and 5 feet 3 inches tall, she weighed just 96 pounds. Her body was quite literally starving to death. Dr. Dana Troxclair, a chief forensic pathologist at the Jefferson Parish Coroner's Office who performed Lacey's autopsy, testified that she suffered from chronic malnutrition and acute starvation. There was virtually no evidence that Lacey was being fed, except for a small bag of hard candy found nearby. Her autopsy revealed that her stomach contained not just feces, but also yellow foam from the couch she had become fused to. Lacey had been so desperate to survive that she had eaten pieces of the couch cushioning and her own feces in an attempt to stay alive. Both feces and couch material were found under her fingernails and in her stomach contents. But malnutrition was just the beginning. Because Lacey had been sitting in the same position for years, she had developed pressure ulcers, commonly known as bed sores. These weren't minor wounds. Dr. Troxclair testified that Lacey had stage 4 decubitus ulcers from head to toe. These were deep, infected craters that had eaten through her skin, through layers of tissue, down to the bone. Some of these ulcers had live maggots living in them. Medical experts would later testify that pressure ulcers of this severity take months, if not years, to develop. The pain would have been constant, excruciating, and completely inescapable. District Attorney Sam D'Aquila put it simply, "You can't say she wasn't in pain." The flesh on Lacey's buttocks appeared to be literally worn or eaten away from the 12 years she hadn't moved from the couch. There were large raw yellow areas where the skin had completely disappeared. Other areas on her back and buttocks were so blackened and deteriorated that even medical professionals had difficulty identifying what they were looking at. Her underside appeared rotten to the bone. Her tailbone had actually flattened from the prolonged pressure of sitting in the same position for such an extended period. She had also suffered kidney failure. Lacey sat in her own waste. Her parents had reportedly placed towels next to her so her feces and urine would be easier for them to clean, though the evidence showed this cleaning was woefully inadequate. Urine and feces accumulated on the couch, on her body, soaking into the crater beneath her. The waste caused infections, painful urinary tract infections, and skin infections that went completely untreated. Her body was breaking down, system by system, while she remained trapped in that same position day after day. Fecal matter was not just beneath her, but had been crushed into her face, chest, and abdomen. Her hygiene had been allowed to deteriorate so catastrophically that her hair was matted, knotted, and filled with live maggots. Dr. Troxclair testified that Lacey's hair was so severely matted that she had to use a scalpel to cut through the locks to untangle them during the autopsy. Vermin, including mice, had begun to eat at her extremities under the couch, leaving mouse droppings throughout the area. Insects and maggots were not just on her body but inside her body, eating away at her while she was still alive. By the time she died, Lacey had also contracted COVID-19. Her immune system, weakened by years of malnutrition and infection, couldn't fight it off. But COVID wasn't what killed her. According to the coroner's official report, the cause of death was medical neglect leading to sepsis, and the manner of death was classified as homicide. Someone had let this happen. Someone had watched Lacey deteriorate for over a decade and done absolutely nothing to help her. The evidence was overwhelming. Crime scene photographs, too disturbing to ever be released to the public, documented everything. When these photographs were shown in court during the sentencing hearing, spectators grimaced in disgust. Some shook their heads. Others covered their mouths, aghast at what they were seeing. Sheriff Jeffrey Travis, who had served for 6 years and dealt with numerous tragic situations, was unequivocal. "I have had a lot of things happen here in East Feliciana Parish, but this type of scene, this is by far the worst." Dr. Bickham echoed this sentiment, calling it the worst form of medical neglect I've ever seen. Investigators examined the entire Fletcher home, looking for any explanation, any mitigating factor that might help them understand how this happened. What they found was even more disturbing than what they expected. But before we get to that, we need to understand something else. How Lacey became completely invisible to the outside world. One of the most disturbing aspects of Lacey's case is how she became completely invisible. She lived in a residential neighborhood in Slaughter, Louisiana, a small community where everyone typically knows everyone else's business. Houses on either side. Neighbors who walked their dogs past the Fletcher home every day. Children playing in nearby yards. The normal rhythms of suburban life happening just feet away from where Lacey was dying. And no one knew. After Lacey's death became public, reporters interviewed neighbors. Robert Blades, who was 61 years old and had been a neighbor of the family, remembered Lacey as just a normal fun kid before she vanished from sight 15 years ago. Some remembered seeing Lacey as a child, as a teenager playing outside, full of life. But then she just stopped appearing. Gradually, over the years, she faded from memory. The family had lived in their home on Tom Drive for almost Lacey's entire life, and yet she simply disappeared. Some neighbors admitted they had wondered what happened to her. Where did that quiet girl go? But no one wanted to pry. No one wanted to be nosy. According to Robert Blades, there was one rumor that circulated after Lacey's death. There was one neighbor here, we don't know who it was, had supposedly seen Lacey on the couch like that and told the parents they had to call the police. And that's what we were told. I don't know how much truth there is in that. If this rumor was true, it means someone may have seen and said something, but nothing was ever done. Americans value privacy, and that's generally a good thing. But privacy can also create environments where terrible things happen behind closed doors. This case exposed a critical gap in how our society protects vulnerable adults. When a child stops going to school, alarm bells ring immediately. Teachers notice. Attendance officers investigate. The system, however imperfect, engages. But Lacey was an adult. No one was taking attendance. No one was required to check on her. The last documented time Lacey left the house was in 2010 for a medical appointment, when she would have been 24 years old. That means for potentially 12 years, she never left her parents' home. Not once. She wasn't receiving government benefits that might have triggered welfare checks. She wasn't employed, so no employer noticed her absence. She didn't see doctors, so no medical professional was monitoring her health. Medical records show she did not have a primary care physician. The last time any doctor saw Lacey Fletcher was in 2002 when she was just 16 years old. For nearly 20 years, she was left unchecked, and sources reported there were no health insurance claims on her record during that time. She simply fell through every single crack in the system. Adult protective services exist in every state, but they're chronically underfunded and understaffed. Unlike child protective services, which can investigate proactively, adult protective services typically only respond to specific complaints. Someone has to notice. Someone has to care enough to make a report. And in Lacey's case, that call never came. There's another troubling question. Did anyone from the Fletchers' extended family know? Court records don't provide clear answers. There's no indication that relatives visited regularly or that anyone outside the immediate household had seen Lacey in years. If family members knew about her condition, none of them reported it to authorities. The Fletchers attended church regularly. Did anyone at their church ask about their daughter? What were they told when people inquired? In 2010, when Lacey was increasingly refusing to leave the house and the couch, her parents went to a doctor's office without Lacey and asked for advice on what to do. According to Dr. Bickham's testimony, the parents explained that she was becoming totally reclusive, not wanting to leave the house or the sofa. The doctor told them to bring their daughter to the hospital for evaluation and treatment. But she was never admitted. No treatment was ever provided. That was the last time her parents sought any professional advice about her condition. The investigation revealed that the Fletchers had effectively isolated Lacey from the entire world. No visitors to the home. No social interactions. Nothing that would expose what was happening in that living room. The Fletchers told investigators that Lacey had become combative and defensive whenever they tried to discuss getting her help. They claimed they had considered getting a commitment order to place their daughter in a medical facility. But Lacey balked at the idea and it never happened. The couple was adamant that Lacey was of sound mind to make her own type of decisions, according to District Attorney DeQuilla. But was she? Could someone in Lacey's condition truly make informed decisions about her own welfare? These questions would become central to understanding this tragedy. Eventually, the truth would come out. And when it did, investigators would face a difficult question. How do you prosecute parents for the death of their adult daughter? After Lacey's body was discovered on January 3, 2022, investigators faced the challenge of building a criminal case. Dr. Bickham immediately recognized that this was not a natural death. After processing the scene with the East Feliciana Parish Sheriff's Office, he placed Lacey's body in a black body bag and transported it to the Jefferson Parish Forensic Center for autopsy. Both he and the investigators at the Forensic Center ruled Fletcher's death as a homicide, believing she died as a result of at least a decade of medical neglect. The physical evidence was overwhelming. The couch, the condition of Lacey's remains, the medical examiner's findings. Everything pointed to years of severe, deliberate neglect. But prosecutors needed to prove more than just that Lacey died from neglect. They needed to establish that Clay and Sheila Fletcher had a legal duty to care for her, that they were aware of her condition, and that they willfully failed to provide necessary care. The investigation revealed several damning facts. Both parents were employed with adequate income. Financial hardship wasn't a factor. Neither parent had mental health issues or cognitive impairments that would have prevented them from seeking help. The rest of their home was clean and well-maintained, proving they were capable of providing care. And there was absolutely no evidence that they had ever attempted to get professional help for Lacey after that single doctor's visit in 2010. No emergency calls. No doctor visits related to Lacey in over a decade. Nothing. When Dr. Bickham arrived at the scene, both parents were present. He described their demeanor. The father was completely emotionless. The mother's head was lying down between her legs. She was weeping a little bit. They had called 911 after discovering Lacey unresponsive, though the coroner believed she had actually died 24 to 48 hours before her mother made that call. According to the coroner's office, Lacey's parents had been away on a weekend trip the weekend that she died, leaving their severely disabled daughter alone in the house. The parents told detectives that Lacey never complained about her sores and that Sheila Fletcher routinely cleaned them. They claimed that the previous fall, Lacey had begun eating less. On January 2nd, the day before the 911 call, she had eaten half a sandwich and some Cheetos. Sheila Fletcher told detectives she last saw her daughter alive at 10 p.m. that night. On May 2nd, 2022, nearly 4 months after Lacey's death, Clay and Sheila Fletcher were arrested and charged with second-degree murder. Their bail was set at $300,000 each. As prominent members of the community with financial resources, they were able to quickly post bond and get out of the East Feliciana Parish Jail. 3 weeks after Lacey's death, on January 24th, Sheila Fletcher resigned from her post on the Slaughter Board of Aldermen, where she had served for 4 years. In Louisiana, second-degree murder doesn't require intent to kill. It requires that death results from actions taken with extreme indifference to human life. Prosecutors argued that letting Lacey deteriorate for 12 years, leaving her to sit in her own waste, denying her medical care, and leaving her alone for extended periods while they went on vacation demonstrated exactly that kind of extreme indifference to human life. District Attorney Sam D'Aquila told reporters, "On a murder, you have to have intent. Did they want to kill her? I want to say yeah, they wanted to kill her." The case went before a grand jury in June 2022. In a shocking decision that stunned the community, the first grand jury declined to indict. They issued what's called a no true bill, meaning they didn't find sufficient evidence to charge the Fletchers with second-degree murder. People couldn't understand it. How could anyone see the evidence and not believe a crime had been committed? District Attorney Sam D'Aquila was equally shocked, but he had options. In Louisiana, prosecutors can present the same case to a second grand jury if they believe the first reached the wrong conclusion. This case was so horrific, D'Aquila told reporters. The coroner and the sheriff's office initially investigated this case in January, and the condition she was found was just unbelievable. You don't treat anybody or animals like that. D'Aquila prepared a more comprehensive presentation for the second grand jury. He brought in medical experts to explain the timeline of Lacey's deterioration. He presented detailed crime scene evidence, including the photographs that documented the full extent of the neglect. He made it impossible for the grand jury to misunderstand the severity and duration of what had happened to Lacey Fletcher. On March 20th, 2023, more than a year after Lacey's death, a second grand jury indicted Clay and Sheila Fletcher on second-degree murder charges. They now faced the possibility of life in prison without parole. But the legal battle was just beginning. The Fletchers' defense attorney, Stephen Moore, filed a motion to quash the indictments, arguing there was defective language in the charging affidavit. He cited 6 discrepancies between the indictment D'Aquila's office served the defendants versus the copy filed with the clerk of court, convincing the judge that the official version wasn't properly amended. If you're finding this case as disturbing as I am, please take a moment to like, share, subscribe to Crime Case Voices. We cover cases that demand attention and victims who deserve to be remembered. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. As the case moved toward trial, the Fletchers' defense attorneys faced an impossible task. The evidence against their clients was overwhelming. The photographs were damning. The medical testimony was unequivocal. The timeline stretched across 12 years. and the fact that both parents maintained normal jobs and lives while Lacey suffered made any claims of ignorance completely unsustainable. In February 2024, more than 2 years after Lacey's death, the legal landscape shifted. On February 5th, instead of going to trial on second-degree murder charges, Clay and Sheila Fletcher accepted a plea deal. They pleaded no contest to the reduced charge of manslaughter. On February 20th, both Sheila and Clay Fletcher surrendered to the East Feliciana Parish Prison and were booked into jail to await sentencing. A no-contest plea isn't an admission of guilt, but it acknowledges that the prosecution has sufficient evidence to convict. It's a legal distinction that matters in court but feels hollow given what happened to Lacey. The plea agreement called for a sentence of 40 years in prison, with 20 years suspended. In practical terms, this meant both Clay and Sheila would serve 20 years in prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. At the time of sentencing, both Clay and Sheila Fletcher were 66 years old. If they serve their full sentences, they will both be 86 when released. These are effectively life sentences. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for March 20th, 2024, at the 20th Judicial District Courthouse in Clinton, Louisiana. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom was packed. Media from across the country had descended on this small Louisiana courthouse. Many people showed up to support the parents, a testament to their standing in the community and the relationships they had maintained throughout this ordeal. However, the prosecution brought in victim advocate Dana Lovett to represent Lacey's interests, since she had no one else to speak for her. Judge Catherine Jones presided over what would become an unusual sentencing hearing. Even though the Fletchers had already pleaded no contest, prosecutors laid out hours of graphic testimony, which is rare for a sentencing hearing. District Attorney DeQuilla explained outside the courthouse, "We wanted to get the word out to the general public and to the judge about exactly what happened in this case. Her abuse and neglect was intolerable, and we want the general public to know that this kind of behavior is not going to be tolerated." DeQuilla showed a gallery of clinical photos from Lacey's autopsy in court. They caused some of the faces in the courtroom to grimace in disgust. Other spectators shook their heads or covered their mouths, aghast at what they were seeing. Dr. Dana Troxclair, the chief forensic pathologist who conducted Lacey's autopsy, provided detailed testimony about the medical findings, describing the stage 4 ulcers, the malnutrition, the evidence of prolonged suffering. Dr. Ewell Bickham, who was the coroner at the time of Lacey's death, took the stand and choked up as he described the scene. He recounted how the skin peeled away as he pulled her body off the couch. He described finding her fused to the furniture, sitting in that crater of waste. His testimony was emotional and powerful, conveying the horror of what he had witnessed. The defense called only one witness, Brandon Romano, a Baton Rouge clinical psychologist, who testified about the psychological dynamics that might have led to this tragedy. The parents themselves provided testimony about their struggles. Clay Fletcher explained, "Her world just closed in gradually more and more and more and more." They described Lacey's diagnoses of autism and agoraphobia, and how her irrational fears had intensified over the years to the point that she stopped brushing her hair and teeth, wouldn't see a doctor, and refused to leave the couch. The defense attorney, Stephen Moore, characterized his client's actions in stark terms. "They loved her to death, and that is the true statement of what the Fletchers are. The things that happened to Lacey are horrible in the way it worked out, but they cared for her daily." But victim advocate Dana Lovett saw it differently. "Nobody should have to have lived like she did all these years. They had so many resources at their fingertips, especially Mrs. Fletcher. Why she didn't utilize those resources when she was actually almost hand in hand with people that could help is beyond me." District Attorney DeQuilla challenged Sheila Fletcher directly during the hearing, asking, "It slowly cocooned into one spot in the house and y'all couldn't see it happening?" Sheila Fletcher, weeping, responded, "Only now." Judge Jones spoke directly about the evidence she had reviewed. She described the conditions Lacey lived in. She emphasized that this wasn't a case of sudden crisis but of prolonged, deliberate neglect that spanned over a decade. "This court has reviewed extensive evidence in this matter," Judge Jones stated. "The condition in which Lacey Fletcher was found defies comprehension." Judge Jones also acknowledged, It is unquestionable Lacey was gravely disabled. Neither Clay nor Sheila Fletcher made formal statements to the court beyond their testimony. They offered no full apology, no complete expression of remorse for what their daughter endured. Their silence in that moment spoke volumes about who they were and what they had allowed to happen. The prosecution asked for the maximum sentence of 40 years. The sentence was handed down exactly as the plea deal specified: 40 years with 20 suspended, meaning 20 years of actual incarceration followed by 5 years of supervised probation. The Fletchers were remanded to Louisiana state custody, separated and sent to different facilities to serve their decades behind bars. For some observers, the sentence brought a measure of justice. These parents had failed their daughter in the most fundamental way possible, and now they would pay for it. But for others, no punishment could adequately address what happened. 20 years in prison couldn't undo 12 years of suffering, couldn't give Lacey back the life she should have had, and it couldn't answer one critical question: how did the entire community miss this? When details of Lacey Fletcher's death became public in late April and early May 2022, the reaction was immediate and visceral. Local news outlets in Louisiana broke the story first, with WBRZ, WAFB, and The Advocate providing initial coverage. But within days it had spread nationally and internationally. The case made headlines in the United Kingdom, Australia, across Europe. Major outlets like Law and Crime, Daily Mail, and News Nation picked up the story. The entire world was horrified. Social media erupted with anger, grief, and disbelief. The case touched a nerve because it challenged fundamental assumptions about how society functions. We want to believe that if someone is suffering, someone will notice, someone will care, someone will intervene. Lacey's case proved that's not always true. In Slaughter, Louisiana, a town with fewer than 2,000 residents, the community was shaken to its core. Residents who had lived near the Fletchers for years struggled with guilt and confusion. Should they have known? Were there signs they missed? Some neighbors told reporters they remembered Lacey as a child but couldn't recall the last time they'd seen her. Years had passed without anyone questioning her absence. In hindsight, it seemed impossible that no one noticed. But in the moment, when it might have mattered, her disappearance went unremarked. This is partly due to how American culture values privacy. We're taught not to pry, not to be nosy, to respect boundaries. Those are generally good principles, but they can also create environments where terrible things happen behind closed doors. Mental health advocates seized on Lacey's case as an example of systemic failure. Here was a young woman who clearly needed intervention. According to testimony and reports, she had been diagnosed with autism and severe agoraphobia. She likely had other undiagnosed conditions that could have been treated. Instead, she was left to deteriorate with no support, no treatment, no hope of recovery. And the system designed to help people like Lacey never engaged because no one reported her situation. Disability rights activists pointed out that Lacey's case represents a broader problem: society's failure to protect vulnerable adults. Unlike children, who are monitored through schools and pediatric healthcare, adults can simply vanish without triggering any alarms. There's no attendance officer for adults, no mandatory wellness checks, no system that flags when someone disappears from public life completely. The case also raised uncomfortable questions about family dynamics and caregiver responsibilities. At what point does a parent's legal duty to care for an adult child end? The law in Louisiana, and in most states, says that duty continues when the adult child cannot care for themselves. Lacey clearly couldn't care for herself. Judge Jones acknowledged she was gravely disabled. Yet rather than seeking help, rather than acknowledging the situation was beyond their ability to handle, Clay and Sheila Fletcher simply continued day after day, year after year. According to testimony, as Lacey's condition worsened in the fall of 2021, she began eating even less. The parents watched this decline but took no action. They continued their normal routines, even leaving her alone to go on weekend trips. And the system that should have protected Lacey had failed at every level. After Lacey's death, District Attorney DeQuilla issued a challenge to the community following the sentencing hearing. Watch out for your friends, talk to your neighbors, and make sure this does not happen to anybody else. It's something that could have been prevented. The question that haunted everyone was, what happened to make Lacey's parents believe this was acceptable? How did they rationalize what was happening? Their attorney claimed they loved her to death. But love that manifests as neglect isn't love at all. Dr. Bickham expressed what many felt. I couldn't eat for a week, and I cried for a week after seeing what had happened to Lacey. Dana Lovett, the victim advocate who represented Lacey during the sentencing, emphasized the resources that had been available. Nobody should have to have lived like she did all these years. They had so many resources at their fingertips, especially Mrs. Fletcher. As someone who had worked in law enforcement and government, Sheila Fletcher knew exactly who to call for help. She chose not to. This case is hard to hear, I know, but these stories need to be told. Please consider liking, sharing, subscribing to Crime Case Voices if you haven't already. Hit the bell. We're dedicated to giving victims like Lacey a voice. To understand how Lacey Fletcher's tragedy occurred, we need to examine the gaps in America's social safety net. The United States has robust systems for monitoring children. Schools track attendance daily. Pediatricians conduct regular checkups throughout childhood. Teachers, doctors, child care providers, and even coaches are mandated reporters, legally required to contact authorities if they suspect abuse or neglect. These systems are imperfect, but they create multiple touchpoints where someone might notice if a child is at risk. But once someone turns 18, those touchpoints largely disappear. Adult protective services exist in every state, but they're chronically underfunded and understaffed compared to child protective services. They typically respond only to specific complaints rather than investigating proactively. The system depends on community members recognizing signs of abuse or neglect and being willing to make reports. Someone has to notice. Someone has to care enough to make a report. And someone at Adult Protective Services has to have the resources to investigate. In Lacey's case, no one ever made that call. Not neighbors who hadn't seen her in years. Not extended family, if they had any contact with the household. Not anyone from the Fletcher's church, where they were regular attendees. Not co-workers from either of their jobs. Part of the problem is awareness. Many people don't know that adult protective services exist or when to contact them. The signs of dependent adult neglect aren't as widely taught or recognized as signs of child abuse. Another issue is the threshold for intervention. With children, concerns about safety can trigger investigations even based on suspicion. With adults, there's a higher bar. Adults have the right to live as they choose, even if those choices seem unhealthy or unusual to others. The system must balance protection with autonomy. This is appropriate in many cases, but what happens when someone lacks the capacity to make autonomous decisions? Lacey wasn't making autonomous choices. Whether trapped by mental illness, by learned helplessness, or by her parents' control, she was unable to advocate for herself or seek help. She needed outside intervention, and the system never reached her. There were no welfare checks. No social workers visited. No one from outside the family ever saw the conditions she was living in until that January morning in 2022 when first responders arrived. After Lacey's death, Louisiana state legislators introduced bills aimed at strengthening adult protective services. These proposals included increased funding for APS agencies, mandatory training for first responders and healthcare workers on recognizing signs of adult neglect, better coordination between different social service agencies, and systems for tracking vulnerable adults who disappear from public life. Similar discussions happened in other states as Lacey's case gained national attention. Lacey's case became a catalyst for national conversations about preventing similar tragedies. Experts began discussing how communities can create informal safety nets. Should there be wellness check programs for adults who haven't been seen in extended periods? Should utility companies or postal workers be trained to report signs of potential neglect? How can we balance privacy rights with protection of vulnerable individuals? But policy change is slow, and funding is always limited. As of 2024, most of the systemic issues that allowed Lacey to become invisible remain unresolved. Many adult protective service agencies are still understaffed and overwhelmed. The reporting systems still depend heavily on community awareness and willingness to get involved. Mental health advocates emphasize that prevention starts much earlier than adult protective services. If Lacey had received proper, sustained mental health care as a teenager, when her social anxiety and isolation first became apparent, her trajectory might have been completely different. According to reports, her parents took her to a psychologist when she was 14 and again when she was 24, but there was no consistent treatment, no long-term therapeutic relationship, no medication management if needed. Early intervention is critical, but it requires recognition that mental health challenges are medical issues deserving of comprehensive treatment, not personal weaknesses to be hidden or ignored. It requires access to affordable mental health care, which remains a significant barrier for many families. It requires reducing the stigma around mental illness so families feel comfortable seeking help rather than trying to manage serious conditions on their own. The Fletcher situation also highlights the phenomenon of caregiver burnout and the need for respite services. When someone has a family member with severe mental illness or disability, the caregiving burden can become overwhelming. Without support services, without respite care, without professional guidance, families can reach a breaking point. This doesn't excuse what happened to Lacey, but it underscores the need for robust support systems for families caring for disabled or mentally ill adults. But there's another layer to this tragedy that experts struggled to understand. How do normal-seeming people allow someone to suffer so profoundly? What psychological processes enable such extreme neglect? Forensic psychologists who reviewed Lacey Fletcher's case offered insights into how severe caregiver neglect develops. It rarely happens suddenly. There's no single moment when parents decide to let their child suffer. Instead, there's a gradual progression, a series of small failures that compound over time until the situation becomes catastrophic. In Lacey's case, it likely began with her parents struggling to cope with her emerging mental health challenges as a teenager. As teenagers, many people go through phases of withdrawal, anxiety, or social difficulty. Most eventually emerge from these phases, either naturally or with appropriate intervention. Lacey didn't. Her isolation deepened instead of resolving. Instead of seeking sustained professional help, the Fletchers may have hoped it would pass. Perhaps they felt ashamed, worried about what people in their small community would think. Maybe they tried to handle it themselves and felt overwhelmed when nothing worked. Mental health stigma, particularly in smaller communities and certain cultural contexts, can make families reluctant to seek help. They may have viewed Lacey's struggles as a family matter, something to be dealt with privately rather than through outside intervention. Whatever the initial dynamic, at some point Lacey stopped leaving the couch. According to the timeline established by investigators, this happened around 2010 when Lacey was approximately 24 years old. That year, her parents went to a doctor without Lacey and asked for advice. The doctor told them to bring Lacey to the hospital. They didn't. This should have been a crisis moment, a clear sign that professional intervention was desperately needed and available. But they didn't follow through. But crisis moments can be normalized through a process psychologists call incremental desensitization. When you're exposed to something abnormal every day, it starts to feel normal. The shock wears off. You adjust. The first day Lacey sat on that couch and didn't get up, her parents must have noticed. It would have been alarming. But maybe they told themselves she'd move tomorrow. She was just having a bad day. When tomorrow came and she was still there, they told themselves it would be the next day. And the next. And the next. Each day, the abnormal situation became slightly more normal. Eventually, weeks turned into months, months into years. Lacey not moving became the status quo. The couch became her bed, her chair, her toilet, her entire world. And her parents adapted to that reality rather than challenging it. As her physical condition deteriorated, the same process of normalization continued. The first time they saw a pressure sore developing, it might have alarmed them. But over time, the smell became something they got used to. The visible wounds became background. The fact that their daughter was wasting away became just another aspect of daily life. They claimed to be cleaning her sores, but clearly this was insufficient. They claimed she never complained, but how could they interpret silence as consent when Lacey had become increasingly nonverbal and withdrawn? Psychologists also discuss compassion fatigue, the emotional exhaustion that can come from prolonged caregiving, especially for someone who isn't improving. Caregivers can become numb, detached, unable to feel the urgency of the situation anymore. They may unconsciously distance themselves emotionally as a protective mechanism. But compassion fatigue doesn't excuse 12 years of neglect. It doesn't explain why Clay and Sheila never called a doctor, never sought help, never did anything to change the situation. What's particularly disturbing is that both parents continued to function normally in their professional lives. Clay went to work and participated in his Civil War Roundtable organization. Sheila worked in law enforcement and government, environments where she was surrounded by people who would have helped if they'd known. She served as an elected official, making decisions about community welfare while her own daughter suffered. They understood intellectually and professionally what neglect looked like. Clay, through his wife's law enforcement work, would have been exposed to discussions about criminal neglect. Sheila, working for police and prosecutors, dealt with cases of abuse and neglect regularly. They just couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge it in their own home. Dr. Bickham noted something telling when he arrived at the scene. He didn't believe the parents were actually living in the home with Lacey on a regular basis. "I don't believe anyone could stand the stench," he said. This suggests they may have been spending significant time away from the house, perhaps staying elsewhere or simply avoiding the room where Lacey was. The coroner noted they had been on a weekend trip when Lacey died, leaving her completely alone. This raises another disturbing possibility. Not just normalization but active avoidance. By staying away from Lacey, by not looking too closely, by not confronting the full reality of her condition, they could maintain their denial. Out of sight, out of mind. But this wasn't ignorance or simple neglect. According to testimony, Sheila claimed to clean Lacey's sores regularly, meaning she had direct physical contact with her daughter and couldn't have been unaware of the severity of her condition. We're almost through this difficult case. If you appreciate the work we do here on Crime Case Voices, bringing attention to victims who deserve justice, please like, share, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. Some forensic experts who reviewed the case noted that the Fletchers never attempted to conceal Lacey's condition once authorities arrived. They didn't try to clean up before calling 911. They didn't construct an elaborate story about what happened. According to accounts, when Sheila called 911 on January 3rd, she simply reported that her daughter wasn't breathing. When first responders and the coroner arrived, the parents were present and allowed them full access to the scene. This lack of concealment suggests they may have been so desensitized that they genuinely didn't recognize how extreme the neglect was. They had lived with the deteriorating situation for so long that it had become their normal. Sheila Fletcher's emotional testimony during sentencing, "Only now," suggests a belated recognition of what they had allowed to happen. For 12 years, they apparently saw nothing wrong. Only when forced to confront it through the criminal justice system did the full horror become apparent to them. That possibility is almost more terrifying than deliberate cruelty. It suggests that ordinary people, under certain circumstances, can become so psychologically removed from reality that they stop seeing suffering right in front of them. It demonstrates how profoundly the human mind can normalize the abnormal, rationalize the irrational, and deny the undeniable. Understanding how this happens doesn't excuse it, but it highlights the critical importance of outside intervention, of community awareness, of systems that can identify when people are in crisis and need help. Because if the Fletchers had been forced to confront Lacey's condition earlier, if a social worker had visited, if a doctor had examined her, if anyone from outside the home had seen what was happening, it couldn't have continued for 12 years. The isolation was key. As long as no one outside the family knew, as long as no one intervened, the situation could continue deteriorating indefinitely. And that's exactly what happened. After hearing testimony during the sentencing, it became clear that there had been decision points along the way where different choices could have changed Lacey's outcome. In 2010, when the doctor advised bringing Lacey to the hospital, they could have followed that advice. When Lacey's eating decreased in the fall of 2021, they could have called for emergency medical services. At any point during those 12 years, they could have sought help. They chose not to. The case raises difficult questions about where individual responsibility ends and systemic responsibility begins. Yes, Clay and Sheila Fletcher are responsible for what happened to their daughter. They had a legal duty to care for her, they were aware of her condition, and they willfully failed to provide necessary care. The criminal justice system held them accountable with significant prison sentences. But the system also failed. The community failed. The checks and balances that should protect vulnerable people failed. We like to think that if something truly terrible is happening, someone will notice and intervene. But Lacey's case proves that's not always true. It proves that people can slip through the cracks, can suffer in silence, can die without anyone outside their immediate household knowing they needed help. That's a sobering reality that should concern all of us. Mental health professionals emphasize that cases like Lacey's, while extreme, aren't as rare as we'd like to believe. Across America, there are vulnerable adults living in conditions of neglect, isolated from society, dependent on caregivers who may be overwhelmed, burned out, or simply indifferent to their suffering. Some of these cases eventually come to light when the victim dies or when someone finally reports the situation. But many never do. The victims die quietly, and their stories are never told. Their deaths may be attributed to natural causes or complications from their underlying conditions, with the neglect never identified or investigated. District Attorney D'Aquila made this point clear in his challenge to the community. Watch out for your friends, talk to your neighbors, and make sure this does not happen to anybody else. It's something that could have been prevented. This wasn't just about the Fletcher family. It was about systemic change in how we care for vulnerable members of our society. Dr. Bickham wanted the graphic photos of Lacey's condition shown to the public, believing that only by confronting the full horror of what happened could we prevent similar tragedies. We don't even treat animals like this, he emphasized repeatedly. The case shocked professional investigators who had seen countless deaths. If trained professionals were so deeply affected, it underscores how severe the neglect truly was. So what can we do to make sure this never happens again? How do we identify the Lacey Fletchers before it's too late? How do we create systems and communities that don't allow people to become invisible? In the aftermath of Lacey Fletcher's death and her parents' conviction, one question remains. What can we learn? How do we prevent this from happening again? The answer isn't simple. It requires changes at multiple levels: policy, community, and individual. From a policy perspective, states need stronger adult protective services. This means adequate funding to hire sufficient staff, competitive salaries to retain experienced social workers, and clear protocols for intervention. It means creating systems that can identify when vulnerable adults disappear from public life and automatically trigger welfare checks. Some experts suggest that adults with documented disabilities or mental health conditions should have mandatory periodic check-ins, similar to how parolees report to parole officers. Louisiana lawmakers introduced legislation inspired by Lacey's case, though progress has been slow. Representative X proposed increasing APS funding and requiring cross-training between APS and law enforcement. The challenge is always funding. Comprehensive social services require significant investment, and that investment must be sustained over time, not just allocated in response to a crisis and then forgotten. But the cost of prevention is far less than the cost of tragedy, both in human terms and in the resources required to investigate and prosecute cases like this after they occur. The criminal investigation, the grand jury proceedings, the trial preparation, the incarceration of Clay and Sheila Fletcher, all of this is exponentially more expensive than the preventive services that could have saved Lacey's life. From a community perspective, we need to reconsider how we balance privacy with responsibility. Respecting people's boundaries is important. We don't want to live in a surveillance state where neighbors are constantly monitoring each other. But when someone vanishes from view entirely, when neighbors haven't seen them in months or years, that should raise concerns. The rumor that a neighbor may have seen Lacey's condition and told the parents to call police, if true, represents a missed opportunity. If that neighbor had called authorities directly, Lacey might have been saved. Making a wellness check request isn't being nosy or intrusive. It's being a responsible community member. It's recognizing that isolation can be dangerous and that vulnerable people sometimes need advocates. Most wellness checks result in finding nothing wrong, and that's okay. Better to check and find someone healthy than to not check and learn later they needed help. If you know someone who has withdrawn from society, If you're concerned about a neighbor you haven't seen in an extended period, if you notice changes in someone's behavior or appearance that concern you, if something feels wrong, make the call. Contact Adult Protective Services in your area. You can make anonymous reports. You might save a life. In Lacey's case, a single phone call at any point during those 12 years could have changed everything. Most importantly, we need to change how we think about mental health. Lacey's isolation began with what were likely treatable conditions: severe anxiety, autism spectrum disorder, possible social phobia or agoraphobia. With proper diagnosis and sustained treatment, including therapy, medication if appropriate, and supportive services, she might have had a completely different life. She might be alive today, living independently or in a supportive community setting, receiving the care she needed. But mental health treatment requires several things: access to care, which means insurance coverage and availability of providers; awareness that mental health challenges are medical issues deserving of treatment, not personal weaknesses to be hidden or ignored; and social acceptance that seeking help is a sign of strength, not weakness. The Fletchers apparently believed they should handle Lacey's problems privately, within the family. That instinct toward privacy, toward keeping family matters within the family, is common in many communities. But it can be deadly when someone needs professional medical intervention. Mental illness is not something most families can manage alone, any more than they could perform surgery in their kitchen. It requires professional expertise, ongoing treatment, and sometimes institutional support. Families struggling with a member's mental health crisis need support, not judgment. They need resources, not shame. They need to know that asking for help is the responsible thing to do, that it demonstrates love and concern rather than failure or weakness. Communities should create support groups for families caring for members with mental illness or disabilities, providing both practical advice and emotional support. Lacey Fletcher's story is a tragedy, but it doesn't have to be only a tragedy. It can also be a catalyst for change. Her death exposed critical gaps in how American society protects vulnerable people. The publicity surrounding her case, painful as it is to recount, has sparked conversations nationwide about adult protective services, mental health care access, and community responsibility. We should remember Lacey not just for how she died, but for who she was. A person who loved playing volleyball, who had beautiful blue eyes and a precious smile, who was described as gentle, sweet, and loving. She was someone's daughter, someone who deserved care, dignity, and the chance to live a full life. She deserved parents who would fight for her, who would seek help when they couldn't manage alone, who would prioritize her welfare over their privacy or pride. She deserved a community that would notice her absence and raise alarms. She deserved a system that would protect her when her parents didn't. She deserved better than she got. We all do. Lacey Ellen Fletcher, born November 25, 1985, died January 3, 2022, at 36 years old. Her life was cut short by neglect. Her death should not be in vain. If her story makes you uncomfortable, if it haunts you, if it makes you angry, good. Let that discomfort motivate action. Let it make you more aware of the people around you, in your neighborhood, your workplace, your faith community. Let it remind you that privacy should never come at the cost of someone's life. Let it inspire you to learn about the warning signs of adult neglect: unexplained absence from public view, reports of a person being too sick to see visitors, unusual reluctance of caregivers to allow access to a dependent adult, or concerns expressed by other family members that are dismissed. And if you see someone who needs help, anyone, anywhere, speak up. Make the call to Adult Protective Services. Be the person who notices. Be the person who cares. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Don't worry about being wrong or causing inconvenience, because somewhere right now there may be another Lacey Fletcher, invisible, suffering, waiting for someone to notice. Thank you for watching this difficult case on Crime Case Voices. If this story affected you, please like, share, subscribe so we can continue telling stories that demand attention and advocating for victims who deserve justice. Hit that notification bell, leave a comment with your thoughts about how we can prevent tragedies like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Resources. If you or someone you know needs help, National Adult Protective Services Hotline, 1-800-677-1116 National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, 988 SAMHSA Mental Health Services, 1-800-662-4357 National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI 1-800-950-6264. All information based on public court records, coroner's reports, and verified news sources including WBRZ, WAFB, The Advocate, Law and Crime, Daily Mail, News Nation, Wikipedia, and True Crime Society blog.